Hey everyone, I'm Josh Stepp. In a previous life, I was a cyber warfare operator. Now I'm in the private sector where I help people solve security problems and other problems with technology. And this is Intrusions in Depth, a passion project of sorts where I break down real-world threat intrusions and the threat actors behind them, from the lens of experience, geopolitics, history, and some mental model analysis. If this sounds like your jam, please take a moment to like, share, subscribe, rate, comment, and everything else I'm missing into your podcast player of choice. It does a lot for the discoverability of the show, and it helps new listeners find it. Thanks. Welcome to the Intrusions in Depth podcast. I'm Josh Stepp. This is a meta episode of sorts that I've wanted to do for a while now. When books, articles, podcasts, etc. cover WANNACRY, the ransomware worm believed to be developed by North Korea, they focus on the chaos, the damage, or the political blowback from the attack, which are all worth covering and I will highlight as well, but there's underlying questions and observations that get glanced over. I believe there's a myriad of reasons that this occurs, the big one being NotPetya, a similar style attack, occurring shortly afterwards, and people needed to react to it. It did a lot of damage too, and in some ways was more robust than WannaCry. WannaCry was the first though, and this crossed a few lines that hadn't been crossed before, at least not publicly. Cyber war was still alive and well by 2017 after all. This was one of those rare times that it leaked publicly. You see, there's arguments that all of this had been going on for a while. The shadow wars fought in the cyberspace between the intelligence communities. But nothing quite like this. Nothing that got worldwide recognition. WannaCry announced this battlefront, this layer of the cyber warfare domain, like a marching band in a parade down Main Street, with elements that sound like a Netflix miniseries. Now, throughout this episode, I'm going to explore some of these questions woven through the WannaCry story. But first, before we do that, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
At 7:44 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time, on Friday, May 12, 2017, a computer somewhere in Asia executed a piece of code, and no one noticed. Somewhere in England, a kettle is boiling. It's Friday, the bookend to a long week of being overworked and underpaid. A nurse named Laura, or Sarah, or maybe it's Michael, it doesn't matter, because this story belongs to all of them, is walking down a corridor towards their workstation. She's thinking about her first patient. Maybe he's thinking about what he left on at the stove at home this morning on his rush out. She is not thinking about North Korea. He is not thinking about the NSA. She's not thinking about a piece of software traveling through the world's computer networks. A cyber weapon moving faster than any hypersonic missile could ever hope to. She sits down. She clicks her mouse. The code is running silently. And beneath that click, something's already waiting for her. A cryptic note. She assumes it's from IT telling them about an outage, some unplanned maintenance. Something else slowing them down from all the patients that they have to see today. And by 8 a.m., it had reached Europe. By noon, it was in the United States. Or by the end of the day, it had touched 150 countries and locked up over 200,000 machines. It moved faster than any news cycle, faster than any government response, faster than any human that could possibly be tasked with tracking it, understanding it, or stopping it. Then social media reports started appearing. Sporadic at first, then everywhere. WannaCry kept being searched. What's a Bitcoin? How do I get a Bitcoin? Those were other popular searches that day. The developed world was facing a threat that not only challenged their productivity in the workforce, but degraded their ability to keep society running smoothly. This was serious. But how did we get here? Let's rewind now. Deep in the secret rooms of mysterious buildings of the National Security Agency, the NSA, or no such agency as it's colloquially known, sits a group that few discussed openly. Most didn't know they existed. The most sophisticated offensive cyber operations group in human history did exist, though, allegedly. These weren't network defenders, blue teamers. They were attackers, the Tailored Access Operations Unit, TAO. And people knew the United States had keyboard commandos, but they didn't know much outside of that. And they didn't know how organized and how equipped they truly were. Until General Michael Hayden, director of the National Security Agency, and later Edward Snowden's leaks, revealed their existence. It was largely thought of as a sort of ghost. Their job, it was to find weaknesses in the world's infrastructure, exploit those weaknesses, and help secure the interests of the United States military and intelligence directives, Title 10 and Title 50 missions. However, there's a fundamental choice that they must make every time they succeed at their job. When they pop a shell, do they tell anyone or keep it for themselves? What's the implications in doing so? This is the equities debate, or more formally, it's called the Vulnerabilities Equities Process, or VEP. The government loves a good acronym after all. This is the dilemma that governments face when they discover or possess a zero-day vulnerability, a software flaw, unknown to the vendor, and is currently unpatched. The core question is whether to disclose it to a vendor like Microsoft for patching, improving overall cybersecurity for everyone, or retain it secretly to use for intelligence gathering, surveillance, or offensive cyber operations. This is messy, especially since software is a globalized industry, and American software is largely seen as the gold standard in many cases. But let's double-click into this. For operating systems like Red Star Linux or other operating systems that's developed for a nation-state or industry specifically, and more importantly, not used in the United States, this is rather easy. Some allies might get butthurt, but they would do the same thing. With stated adversaries, Russia, China, North Korea, it flies, it dies. The North Koreans have their own version of Linux, ISIS having their own Linux versions as well, or even discussion from European countries today, for that matter, having their own OSs. This makes that debate really easy. There's little to no harm done to U.S. citizens and U.S. organizations and U.S. interests in not disclosing those flaws. In some ways, moving off of American software makes this argument easier for the Americans that have morals and a sense of duty to the government, I guess. However, for large American organizations like Microsoft, this can turn into a dumpster fire really fast. You see, Microsoft is used everywhere. And for that reason, exploits in the operating system and products, they have a long shelf life and they can open a lot of doors. It makes sense to look for vulnerabilities to exploit them. On the other hand, Microsoft is an American business with Americans that work there, that pay American taxes, and those taxes are used to fund the NSA and the government in general. Then there's another fundamental problem with these weapons built by offensive attackers. Code as a weapon is multi-use and easy to copy. You can't copy and paste 2,000-pound bombs or NATO 5.56 rounds. You can't just pick up a bomb that's exploded and then turn it back against your enemies. This is one of the differences in cyber warfare. Maintaining control of these weapons is incredibly difficult, and using them opens up the possibility of them being used back at you. And this is where Eternal Blue and Double Pulsar enters the picture. Eternal Blue targets a flaw in how Windows handles SMB v1 transaction requests. SMB v1, or Server Message Block version 1, is a network file sharing protocol that operates over TCP port 445. Now, SMB allows clients and servers to communicate for operations like file sharing, printer access, and just inter-process communication. Now, this exploit takes advantage of a buffer overflow in the way that Windows parses SMB transaction structures. Specifically, it exploits incorrect casting and validation in a function, which handles the conversion between OS2 file extension attributes list and Windows NT FEA or file extended attributes. In simpler terms, there's a conversion that takes place in the metadata of files, and when they're converted using this protocol, and in that conversion, there's an opportunity to induce a buffer overflow. which to me is kind of insane that someone found this in such an obscure portion of code. Now, through a technique known as pool grooming, which is a form of heap spray attack, in this case targeting Windows kernel memory, the attacker sends a sequence of specifically crafted SMB packets that manipulate the kernel pool's allocator memory layout in a predictable state. Now, this allows the attacker to place shellcode and kernel memory, achieving remote code execution, RCE, at the kernel level without any interaction or authentication. And if that's over your head, I got you. Basically, it means if you have port 445 open on your machine and an attacker can send packets to it, they can pwn your machine. And in case that was over your head, just know that this is bad, really hard to guard against. And if the code can get a stronghold behind your firewall, or if your firewalls aren't configured correctly, it gets really nasty really fast. Now, Double Pulsar was the implant that runs in kernel mode, granting attackers the highest level of control over the compromised system. Once installed, it exposed 3 commands: ping, which was to check if the implant was alive, kill, to remove itself, and exec, which is load and execute arbitrary code. And in this case, it was good old shellcode. Double Pulsar was pretty dank at the time because it was a RAM resident or in-memory payload, fileless malware, so it didn't leave any files on disk. So the flow with both of these was that Eternal Blue was used to get in the door, and it would check if Double Pulsar was present. And if it was, it would send the shellcode for the follow-on activities. We'll discuss more of this in a bit when we start talking about WannaCry's nuts and bolts. Now, if Double Pulsar was missing, it would install it and then do the follow-on activities for WannaCry. So just imagine for a minute that you have a master key that works on nearly every Windows computer on Earth, a key that the NSA stored in their armory for years, allegedly. And this leads us to a question I want you to all ponder. Does a government have the right to leave its own citizens vulnerable in order to maintain an offensive advantage? And speaking of questions, you may be scratching your head at this point and start asking, why are we talking about the NSA here? I thought you said earlier that North Korea was believed to have been the developers of WannaCry. Well, I'm getting there. But first, let's talk about Russia, comrade. On the world stage, 2017 was a shakeup in geopolitics. In the United States, President Donald Trump was sworn into his first term, and allegations of Russian involvement were in full swing. Which, almost a decade later, and after document dumps and congressional testimony, this was mostly a cope as the reason he got into the White House instead of Hillary Clinton. She was widely believed to be the overwhelming favorite if you followed the pollsters at the time. And just double-clicking on that cope statement, since I know some people lean hard one way or another, but here in 2026, we've had numerous releases from ODNI, Tulsi Gabbard, by now, and other government releases, as well as those by private organizations that highlight most of this was overblown at best and fabricated at worst. I'll link through to some of that as well. But also, if you're a regular guy or girl listening to that statement and it enrages you to the point of tribal anger to email some random dude on the internet, you need to get some hobbies or more going on in your life. Now, enough with the public safety statements. In August of 2016, a sketchy group called the Shadow Brokers began releasing cryptic messages, rants, manifestos, something on Pastebin describing a trove of secret documents that they claimed belonged to the Equation Group. Now, the Equation Group's a name given to the NSA operators, TAO, or some clustered activity from Kaspersky, a Russian cybersecurity firm. And they do good work, but they are Russian, so you got to take that with a grain of salt. Well, to correct myself, this was mostly on X or Twitter at the time, with links to all of those pastebins. And to this day, the Shadow Brokers are still unidentified and uncaught. No one knows if they were like a lone actor, a foreign intelligence operation, or something else entirely. Well, I guess besides them. However, it's widely believed that the Shadow Brokers were Russian intelligence officers or a group affiliated with the Russian intel apparatus. But the Shadow Brokers did something unprecedented. They stole alleged NSA cyber weapons and began auctioning them. Then, when the auction failed on April 14, 2017, approximately 4 weeks prior to WannaCry being released on May 12, 2017, well, they released all of them for free to the public. So while the NHS nurse is doing her rounds, the FedEx driver is picking up and delivering packages, some of the most dangerous cyber weapons in the world are released quietly on the internet for anyone with a browser to download and harness. A set of keys to open doors, doors that could belong to anyone. It's a loyalty-free weapon, and this is the idea that the moment the code left control of the NSA, it stopped belonging to anyone. It had no loyalties to its creators, nation, no restraints really, besides some firewall rules. It was just out on the internet waiting for anyone to pick it up and repurpose it to aim at anyone else. And this is how an alleged NSA American exploit was stolen by the Russians, supposedly, and utilized by the North Koreans, allegedly, to attack the world. But why? Or was this a mistake? Well, to answer that, we need to go to Pyongyang. Now, if you've been a longtime listener of this podcast, you probably know by now that my favorite group of attackers or nation state of attackers are the North Koreans. If we ever normalize relations or the Kim experiment goes down in flames, I hope there's a collaboration effort between the North Korean teams that they can write and tell all in a book or something. I think they're the most resourceful, effective, and fun to read about. There's something about North Korea in general that pegs my curiosity. The Hermit Kingdom is interesting to me as it's kind of shut off and mysterious. But I do feel bad for the citizens living under such harsh conditions. However, there's an almost cartoonish tendency to make the North Koreans, especially the Kim regime, comic book villains, or a sort of clown king phenomenon. The best representation of this is the Team America World Police movie and their depictions of Kim Jong-il. But this is also present in such fine cinema as the movie The Interview, starring James Franco and Seth Rogen. Despite the odd ceremonies, crazy backstories for events, and extreme public displays of execution, a la anti-aircraft gun or airport poisoning, in cyber warfare, they operate as a rational actor under completely different sets of constraints than Western nations. And this is a concept that Western analysts, or at least their reports, struggle to internalize. The North Korean cyber program is not analogous to anything in Western military doctrine. It's not a Western concept to think that you can use the military to make money for the government. Well, not yet at least, hopefully. Now, there's probably arguments for that being the case, but it's not the purpose stated on like the Go Army hype commercials or the reason Marines turn into chess pieces and slay dragons in commercials holding swords and stuff. For North Korea, it's simultaneously an intelligence apparatus, a revenue generation machine, and a weapons development program, all operating under a regime that faces the most comprehensive international sanctions on Earth. Cyber operations are considered a cost-effective way for North Korea to maintain an asymmetric military option, as well as a means to gather intelligence and fund weapons programs. And this is where the Lazarus Group comes in. Well, in a way. I want to keep our story going with the caveat that I'm lying to you right now. Not actively deceiving you, but just lying by omission or nuance in key facts. I'm going to tell you the whole truth later, I promise. But to keep the story going, just know that I'm lying to you right now. But it's widely believed that the Lazarus Group, the offensive cyber leg of the North Korean military, was responsible for the development of this weapon. This cyber weapon that propagated via stolen exploits from the NSA, allegedly, by the Russians, allegedly, and repurposed by the North Koreans as part of a ransomware attack, allegedly. A worm that spreads to any Windows machine with port 445 open. And the world wasn't ready for what was coming next. On May 12th, 2017, WannaCry detonated. There were no sirens, no radar blips of incoming threats, no intercepted transmissions, no warnings or suspicious individuals, no changes in the nation's defense posture, no huge buildup off the coast of the Atlantic, just silence. Then chaos. Computers locked up, banks having issues, society's infrastructure was starting to crumble. But let's get into the weeds here of the malware itself. My mental model for the WannaCry family of malware is to think of it in parts. I find it helpful to think about WannaCry being two of these cyber weapons. Sorry, I chuckle still when I say those words together, but two types of malware combined together. The first of which was a fairly conventional ransomware payload. It was a 3.7 megabyte, 32-bit Windows PE file with a self-extracting embedded executable and service installer for the worm portion. The second was the double pulsar eternal blue chain, which was used to propagate the worm worldwide. And since it used a no-auth unpatched Windows exploit, things got fun. Now let's take a minute to run through the entire execution flow. And warning, we're going to get kind of deep here. So the ransomware portion, the piece of the software that encrypts all your files and displays the page telling you where to send your Bitcoins, had actually been kicking around in February and March of 2017. It was dubbed the WANNACRY, and there's evidence that it infected a few machines, mostly through the use of backdoors and stolen credentials. This is a very manual process. You need to log into the system or trick the user into clicking on something or opening something or giving you access. Then you do your little / or clicky to the file. Now, WannaCry married that generic ransomware payload with some functionality to the stolen exploit to create an automatic propagating worm. So when the binary executed, the first thing it did was look for a specific domain. It's a long string of letters and numbers to a .com address. Now, if the malware makes a connection to the address, it stops the execution flow. Luckily, when this thing was kicking off, that domain was not registered. So then it went on to install the service. There's two core theories about that domain kill switch, though. The first of which that it was placed there as a sort of sandbox evasion technique. Many commercial or even homemade malware analysis sandboxes will resolve any domain to a local IP to observe malware behavior. By checking a deliberately nonsensical unregistered domain, the malware could detect if it was running in a sandbox, where the domain would resolve, versus on a real victim's machine, where it wouldn't. The kill switch would likely kept the code so it could go undetected in systems that weren't sandboxes for malware. In other words, it was a mechanism to differentiate between a real and sandboxed environment. The second theory is that this was a test. You might want to have a remote kill switch if this gets out of hand. Sort of like it makes sense to have a cure if you're going to be making crazy viruses in a lab. Both of those theories have holes, though. The problem with the sandbox evasion theory is that most sophisticated malware uses randomized domain generation or checks multiple addresses. Hard-coding a single static domain as your only anti-analysis check is crude. It's either sloppy or it's something else entirely, but it's not going to stop most reverse engineers. Now, the test theory is more speculation, as there's other aspects that don't make sense. I'm going to circle back to this in a moment, though. But after the domain doesn't resolve, WannaCry installs itself as a Windows service called MSSec SVC 2.0 with the display name Microsoft Security Center 2.0 service. This gives it persistence and system-level privileges. The service dispatcher then kicks off the worm. This is what made WannaCry fundamentally different than any other ransomware at the time. It spawned two separate threads to propagate simultaneously. Now, thread 1 was LAN scanning, or local area network. The malware gets the IP addresses of the local area interfaces using the getAdaptersInfo API, then generates a list of all the possible IP addresses and the available local network, or the broadcast domain, and tries to connect to them. Now, thread 2 was looking outward. The internet scanning second thread generates random IP addresses and attempts to connect on port 445, SMB, to find vulnerable hosts on the public-facing internet. Now, the technical term for this is what I call YOLOing. Now, for each target, the attack chain is step 1, double pulsar check. The worm specifically scans for the existence of the double pulsar backdoor on compromised systems. If it's already installed from like a previous compromise or another attacker, WannaCry just uses the existing backdoor to inject itself, and this is a free ride, no exploit needed. If there is no double pulsar running, but the remote machine is vulnerable, it uses the embedded Eternal Blue exploit to deliver the double pulsar backdoor payload. Then, by doing the previously mentioned YOLOing, it was randomly spreading, and this went exponential. As more hosts got infected, more YOLOing occurred. It's worth noting that port 445 exposure varies widely by country. In the United States, most consumer ISPs have been blocking port 445 at the network layer for years, going back to like the Conficker worms of 2008. This was one reason the United States was hit far less severe than some of the other regions. But internally, Within corporate and government networks, 445 was wide open because SMP is how Windows file sharing works. It's the plumbing. You can't just turn it off without breaking things in a corporate network. Now, countries with less mature ISP level filtering, or where organizations relied heavily on legacy unpatched Windows systems, well, they got hit a lot harder. Russia, India, Ukraine, Taiwan were amongst some of the most affected in terms of raw infection counts. Now, step 3 happens once double pulsar was implanted by the Eternal Blue exploit. It opened a backdoor, which was used by attackers to deploy secondary malware onto systems. Double pulsar hooks the sysenter routine at the kernel level and uses QUser APC injection to move from kernel space to user space, giving it the ability to inject arbitrary code into the user mode processes. Now, step 4 was when WannaCry was delivered. Now, double pulsar injects a launcher DLL on the remote machine and invokes a export called play game. Now, this launcher downloads and executes the full WannaCry package. The newly infected machine then begins its own propagation cycle, scanning, exploiting, spreading, etc. Which, given the success rate it has with getting in the door, nearly 100% with Eternal Blue, this equals exponential growth and more machines getting pwned really fast. Adding to that was that this setup was built for maximum effectiveness, as the malware carries both x86 and x64 versions of the launcher DLL to handle both 32-bit and 64-bit targets. Then came the ransomware setup, WannaCryptor 2.0. Once the worm had delivered the payload and it was executing locally, WannaCry starts to unpack itself. The main executable extracts a password-protected zip file. The password was WANNACRY at 2017, if you were curious. But this folder contained a message with the ransom notes in 28 languages. It was RTF files with a .WNRY extension. Then there was B.WNRY, which was the wallpaper bitmap. And as a note, instead of saying WNRY, I'm just going to say C WannaCry going forward, so I'm not repeating the same file extension. But C WannaCry was the Tor configuration data. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The R WannaCry, which was the ransom frequently asked questions text. The S WannaCry, which was a bundled Tor client. T WannaCry was the encrypted ransomware DLL file. U WannaCry was the decryptor executable. And then there was taskdll.exe, which was a cleanup utility, and taskse.exe. And this was used to launch the decryptor on other sessions. So the malware then hides the extracted directory, modifies security descriptions, creates persistence via registry run keys, and then checks for a mutex, global MS Win Zones Cache Counter Mutex A. This later became like a cyber vaccine of sorts. Security teams could put this mutex on to prevent encryption of already compromised machines. But it was a little late to the game. The next phase was the encryption event. And it used a recovery chain, which pretty much looks like the attacker's RSA private key is used to decrypt the victim's RSA private key. And then that is used to decrypt per file AES keys, which led to decrypting all of the files. I could go into kind of details of that whole chain, but it doesn't really fit the podcast episode, and it kind of gets us bogged down into some of the technical weeds. It's really best to kind of go through that with the display or like a demonstration. But this is a pretty legit cryptographic implementation. It's highly likely that researchers wouldn't find a flaw in this process, so it's likely you would need a key or strong backups to recover. Or if you had certain hard drives. I'll get there. But when doing the research for this episode, I didn't see any bypasses that may exist. Double-clicking down into the file targeting, WannaCry then enumerates all available disk on the system, including local drives, removable drives, and network drives mapped to the drive letters. Then it targets a specific list of file extensions, documents, images, databases, archives, source code, virtual machine files, basically anything of value, which shows the signs of a well-thought-out plan. Encryption events take time. And this is why modern EDR can be really effective against it. It's easier to fingerprint most of the time, and using items like canary files, hidden files with those extensions, can be a really good signal for this happening. If these hidden files are tampered with, that indicates that you should lock down the system to prevent further damage. Even if it does false positive and lock down a legitimate user poking around at hidden files, the trade-off, they lose an hour or 4 of productivity is well within the return on investment compared to dealing with a much larger encryption event. You isolate that person from the network, kill some processes, and obviously there's edge cases that get through, but usually this is an agreed upon stance within the industry. Now, technically, builder type endpoints are always a pain. Technical end users like developer machines where code is running and sysadmins that have more access or more privileges to run systems from the internet, well, they've always kind of been the bane of existence to modern SOCs. For defenders, there's a nuance that you need to observe when triaging sysadmin or attacker behavior. Automated, scripted actions, discovery commands, and weird jumps between systems can be the norm in those. Now we incorporate in the God year of 2026 in the world of AI agents, and things get a lot more interesting though. Is this Jim and Sally the sysadmins, or did they install OpenClaw on their machines and give it API access and creds to their account, and then they turned it loose to make room for their afternoon painting and yoga session? Or now everyone uses OpenClaw, Claude Cowork, or something else, and it's doing sketchy stuff. Don't know. I can't triage the entire org right now. Or if you find a way to inject prompts to pull down payloads or overwrite like local MCP servers or something, or being able to like influence SEO or GEO enough to influence like a worldwide event just by social engineering these agents. It seems kind of weird that we live in a world where we have to trick computers. I did see the meme from Elon Musk of someone handing an AK-47 to a chimpanzee as a synonym for giving OpenClaw access to all of your internet accounts. So we're heading into wild times, people. But let's get back to the wild times of 2017. During the WannaCry encryption event, each target file is open, read, encrypted in memory, and then written to a new file using the file name format, randomname.wannacry. That's how it got its name, just in case you were still curious. Then those files are renamed to their original file name with the WannaCry extension and moved to their original directory. This is getting super in the weeds, but technically the encryption process does not directly overwrite file data. So forensic recovery of file contents may be possible depending on the environment. But this needs to be on like hard disk drives, not SSDs, real live disk spinners. The deleted originals might be recoverable with forensic tools because WannaCry didn't securely wipe the source files. Now, operationally doing this at scale is going to be a nightmare. You would only enlist the help of consultants to do this for high-value machines, then wipe and re-image the rest, or just send them to like the wood chipper and get new stuff. The next part of the WannaCry execution flow is now the norm for ransomware events, but back in 2017, I always thought of this as a giant move. It deleted the volume shadow copies. These are the backup restore points on Windows, usually a high-value target for attackers. And like I said, it's the norm in ransomware these days, but still a pretty crappy thing to do. The last part of this execution flow is presenting the ransomware presentation. Now, in a borderline psychotic and immature confession, these HTML screens, ASCII art, and the sound effects are my favorite part of ransomware wiper attacks. If my computer got locked up, I would probably be mad like anyone else, but part of me enjoys the message, the creativity, and the thought that goes into making these. And the North Koreans have a 1990s, early 2000s GeoCities art vibe that just hits differently. It really resonates with me in my childhood. Now, specifically for WannaCry, the wannadecryptor.exe, the PE file that launches a GUI displaying a countdown timer, in this case 3 days until the ransom doubles, and 7 days until the files are deleted. Well, there's also payment instructions directing to one of 3 hard-coded Bitcoin wallet addresses, as well as a check payment button and a decrypt button. Now on the back end, a Tor client spins up and communicates with .onion command and control sites for payment verification and key delivery. But this is where things start to not make sense. It's not clear this part of the process was ready for prime time, which further highlights that this was an escape rather than like a full-blown cyber weapon demonstration. In other words, it's more of an oopsie. Having only 3 Bitcoin wallets for something this damaging makes no sense. 3 wallets for 200,000 plus infections. There's no unique identifiers to map out victims. The check payment and decryption functions were unreliable at best. And most experts believe that no one actually got them to work who paid the Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin ask was super low. It was like $300 US. Even the White House put out guidance saying that paying the ransom wouldn't unlock your computer. So if you're financially backed, or if this was a financially backed operation, this pretty much nukes the option of you even getting paid for this operation. Then, is it still financially backed? I don't really think so. This is a well-engineered worm bolted onto a poorly engineered ransomware operation. The Eternal Blue double pulsar propagation chain is sophisticated. It has dual-threaded scanning, proper kernel exploitation, cross-architectural support. The crypto implementation is solid, but the monetization infrastructure is amateur hour, junior varsity crapware. 3 hard-coded wallets, no automated payment verification, no reliable decryption delivery. The WannaCry payment system made it essentially impossible to map payments to specific victims at scale. Whether this was incompetence, indifference, or intentional is the question that sits underneath everything. In some ways, there's an asymmetry that we need to evaluate, but you need to approach this from the understanding that allegedly the heavy lifting of this op was performed by some of, if not the best exploit devs in the world. Those within the NSA or contracted out to the agency, which is why what the shadow brokers did was such a big deal. When the shadow brokers leaked these tools, it represents a much larger loss than simply custodian of the code. Sure, it takes time to develop and test these exploits, so it sets back an adversary if you evaluate it through like a US-Russia lens. However, it also put powerful tools in the hands of non-sophisticated users, which is one of the arguments for AI control today. But that's an entirely different episode. But now I want to focus on the kill switch and the researcher who found it. As I opened with, WannaCry was different and forced a bunch of meta questions around cybersecurity and disclosure. Or more importantly, there needs to be something more robust for government disclosure. Most people in the security community are against government coerced backdoors and products. But is it a backdoor if the vendor doesn't know it exists and the government has an exploit for it? I don't know. There's also the angle of using alleged stolen nation-state grade exploits in a worm, the damage it did, as well as the philosophical questions of responsibility, disclosure, and the role of government and how we treat heroes with the backstory. And as you'll hear in this section as well, the KPIs for the Justice Department, as well as what constitutes actual harm, are questions worth asking ourselves. Now, if you remember earlier when I discussed the execution flow of WannaCry, I mentioned that it had a kill switch domain check in the beginning of the operation. The malware had logic to look for some obscure domain prior to executing the harmful bits and locking up the computer it was on. That domain wasn't registered at the beginning. So WannaCry spread fast. So fast that malware researchers, people responsible for discovering, analyzing, and providing signatures to security vendors, took notice and was working overtime, sharing samples back and forth. In one of those samples, a 22-year-old malware analyst discovered the kill switch. And from all accounts, he was surprised in some ways that this plague could be neutralized so easily. It appeared that he could stop a global event, wrecking computers, not with some sophisticated code or some weird script, but by registering a domain. So he tested this hypothesis. The malware analyst paid the $10 and change to buy this odd domain and then put it up on the internet. And things got quiet. The infections appeared to stop. And no one really understood why, until the security researcher, who frequently posted online as Malware Tech, a pseudonym, explained that he had believed that he had stopped it. Since it was Twitter and some people thought he was full of, but it was quickly became apparent that something had happened, and his logic made sense. And then, through highly aggressive tabloid reporting, in which they published his name and full address, the world was introduced to Marcus Hutchins. Now, Marcus Hutchins' story is one that a Hollywood screenwriter would dream up. He was born in 1994 in England to a Scottish nurse and Jamaican social worker parents. And from an early age, he showed aptitude with computers. He lived in a small seaside town in England, and as some of the tabloid put it, he was an accidental hero, the surf dude who saved the internet. And by all accounts, Hutchins was seen as a hero. He was. Or, at the very least, a man who saw what was the right thing to do, and he did it. He didn't wait for someone else to figure it out. And I've got a lot of respect for that. And honestly, I didn't intend on focusing too much on Marcus Hutchins for this episode, as there's a lot more details on Marcus Hutchins on other podcasts and articles, I highly suggest listening to his Darknet Diaries episode. It's really good. I'll link through to it as well. But as I was editing this episode, I felt like this was a good time to talk about some of the meta questions that we should all consider and that WannaCry kind of brought to the surface. Questions around what is actual harm? How should we or society treat people who do good things, but they have a cloudy past? And what about the KPIs for like prosecutors? These were like second and third order effects for WannaCry, admittedly. But as the name of this podcast suggests, I like to go in depth and get in the weeds. And to do that, I need to go deeper with this portion. Marcus Hutchins, by all accounts, got to be a security researcher the old school way. By doing illegal with computers, he started on the other side. I was really trying to throw in a power of the dark side quote here, but nothing really clicked. As I said earlier, Marcus was good with computers from an early age. He could do things with computers that other kids couldn't. Things like getting around security controls at school and doing important things, like installing video games. Taught himself how to code, and spent a lot of time on forums on the internet. Not forums discussing recipes or scrapbooking, but hack forums, a toxic place full of young people who show off their conquests, share alternative software samples, and try to dox each other in flame wars. I've talked about some of this in my laps this episode, and the Virus Factory had an earlier version of this too. Now, it all started off rather wholesome. Bitcoin miners, but nothing really that hurt people, just the rainforest. But as the forums have a way of doing, they introduced Marcus to people. And one of those people was named Vinny. This was a pseudonym. You see, by this time, Marcus Hutchins had gotten a reputation of being a malware ghostwriter of sorts. Quoting from the Wired article titled "The Confessions of Marcus Hutchins, the Hacker Who Saved the Internet" by one of my favorite reporters, authors, Andy Greenberg, quote, "When Hutchins posted some sample code to show off his growing skills, another Hack Forums member was impressed enough that he asked Hutchins to write part of a program that would check whether a specific antivirus engine could detect a hacker's malware, a kind of anti-antivirus tool. For that, Hutchins was paid $200 in the early digital currency of Liberty Reserve. The same customer followed up by offering $800 for a form grabber Hutchins had written, a rootkit that could silently steal passwords and other data that people had entered into web forms and send them to the hacker. He happily accepted." End quote. I'll link through to this article as well. But Vinny wanted something more robust, more polished. He wanted a multi-featured, well-maintained rootkit that he could sell on the more sophisticated hacker forums. This is the kind where people paid money and probably had like Lambos in Russia and ate caviar with their pinkies up while looking at tigers and stuff. And this time, the payment terms were different. He would pay Marcus half the profits for every unit sold. And they would call this rootkit the Upas kit, named after the toxic Upas tree of Java, where its sap could be used to make like poison darts and poison arrows. One thing that stuck out in Andy Greenberg's story that I don't think it's highlighted enough is Vinny, or the entity known as Vinny. I'm going to read another excerpt from Andy Greenberg's article because he's a much better writer than I am, and it kind of sums it all up. Quote, "Vinny seemed different from the braggarts and wannabes that Hutchins had met elsewhere in the hacker underground. More professional and tight-lipped. He never revealed a single personal detail about himself, even as they chatted more and more frequently. And both Hutchins and Vinny were careful to never log their conversations," Hutchins said. As a result, Wired has no record of their interactions, only Hutchins' account of them. Hutchins says that he was always careful to cloak his movements online, routing his internet connection through multiple proxy servers and hacked PCs in Eastern Europe, intending to confuse any investigator. But he wasn't nearly as disciplined about keeping the details of his personal life secret from Vinny. In one conversation, Hutchins complained to his business partner that he had no quality weed to be found anywhere in his village, deep in rural England. Vinny responded that he would mail him some from an e-commerce site called the Silk Road. This was 2011, early days for Silk Road, and the notorious dark web drug marketplace was mostly known only to those in the internet underground, and not the masses who would later discover it. Hutchins himself thought it had to be a hoax. "Bull," he remembers writing to Vinny, "prove it." So Vinny asked for Hutchins' address and his date of birth. He wanted to send him a birthday present, he said. Hutchins, in a moment he would come to regret, supplied both. And on Hutchins' 17th birthday, a package arrived for him in the mail at his parents' house. Inside was a collection of weed, hallucinogenic mushrooms, and ecstasy, courtesy of his mysterious new associate. End quote. So I have heard stories of other people claiming Marcus Hutchins was full of crap here and telling a story to justify his criminal past. Maybe. I personally don't get that vibe, and I'm not some expert in reading people or a judge of character or anything. But Vinny's operational security is pretty top-notch, and his intel harvesting methods are too. When I first read this story back in the day, Vinny immediately gave me Fed vibes, or glowy vibes, as it's sometimes called. And that's just a general pejorative for a government actor involved. Now, I'm in the middle of researching another episode on child soldiers recruited for operations from the Russia-Ukraine war, and it isn't direct TTPs, but they are similar. Maybe it's just top of mind for me right now. But Vinny could just be a criminal that knows what he's doing, not an intelligence agent as well. There's always that angle too. Just he seemed to collect info on markets like a pro, establish trust and rapport, gain leverage, and obviously got someone to do the bidding for a larger operation. Now, Hutchins was reportedly torn on this. He says he pushed back on some of the more dangerous capabilities, but he also kept working, in part because he wanted to get paid for his work that he had already done, and in part because, according to multiple reports, Vinny had figured out his identity and was leveraging that knowledge against him. Not an excuse, just context. UPA's version 1 went live in summer of 2012, and payments started rolling in via Bitcoin. Soon, Vinny came back asking for UPA's version 2, based off the success of the first rootkit. Vinny wanted more features like a keylogger and a screen recorder, but also a web inject functionality. Hutchins knew that there was only one reason that someone would ask for that. They were building a banking Trojan, malware designed to steal victims' banking information and their money. Marcus Hutchins objected to this demand, but only had so much leverage. You see, Vinny could easily rat him out to the law enforcement agencies after all. He had his address and his name. They eventually came to an understanding. Marcus would do everything but the web inject functionality, and after nights of working on the kit, he shared it with his business partner, only to find out that Vinny had hired someone else to write the web inject functionality. And reluctantly, Marcus agreed to incorporate that code within his project and maintain it. The money was nice after all, and he didn't feel like he had much of a choice. In 2014, the new piece of kit dropped. It was no longer called UPAS, opting this time for the name Kronos, the father of the Greek god Zeus. Marcus Hutchins went on to get a real job and pull away from the dark side in favor of legit work, gaining a following as malware tech and becoming very good at threat intel and reverse engineering. Fast forward to August 2017, months after WannaCry fame, Marcus traveled to the US for DEF CON in Las Vegas. Now, obviously, everyone knew him as the guy who stopped WannaCry, and he was seen as a sort of celebrity figure among the crowd. He was being treated like a rock star, where his accomplishments were truly understood. Then, on August 3rd, 2017, he was arrested by the FBI in the airport heading back to England. As the news spread, everyone was confused. Why are they arresting this quote-unquote hero? Well, this is where things get complicated. He was charged with 6 counts, not related to WannaCry, but Kronos. And, well, listeners, the FBI had been building a case. When they seized the Alpha Bay dark web marketplace in 2017, they found evidence linking Hutchins to the Kronos cell. They had his old chat logs from seized servers, and when WannaCry made him famous and his real identity became public, the FBI connected the dots. His trip to Las Vegas was a golden opportunity. You see, he was a British citizen on American soil, which means that they could arrest him without going through the extradition proceedings with the UK government. Now, one part I found funny as someone who's been on the other side of this was the evidence the FBI presented to Marcus. Apparently, they gave him a folder of sheets of paper with gibberish on them and some random strings. Now, I knew what this was as soon as I heard it. They ran a cat command on the executable, piped it to a text file, and hit Control-P to use taxpayer-funded ink and paper to print out an executable. Hundreds of sheets of paper with random strings in it and symbols. Just straight gibberish. I mean, evidence. But this is what they threw down in front of him. No, obviously, he eventually got it once he read through the strings in it. But, what do you expect's going to be the outcome here? Now, sure, they could just present the evidence in like a different way, but whatever. Now, double clicking out of that, the security community was split. Some people saw a reformed individual who had demonstratedly changed his life, and by the way, saved the world from a cyber weapon, being punished for things he did as a teenager. Others pointed out that Kronos had real victims. People had their bank accounts compromised. Real money was stolen from real people. The fact that he later did something good doesn't erase that harm. And the tension is worth sitting with, because it doesn't have a clean answer. This is one of those questions I'm going to let you think about. Hutchins was initially charged with 6 counts and pled not guilty. He was placed under house arrest in Los Angeles, initially with a strict curfew and GPS monitoring. The FBI tried to negotiate with him. They wanted information on Benny and other hackers that he knew from his forum days. Now, in exchange, they offered reduced sentences. Hutchins said that he couldn't provide any useful information on Benny, and he refused to turn in the other people that he knew. Well, the FBI responded by adding 4 more charges to the indictment. That was awful nice of him. In April 2019, Hutchins changed his plea. He pled guilty to 2 counts related to writing and distributing the Kronos and UPass kit. Now, in a public statement, he wrote that he had regretted his actions for years and that having grown up, he wished that he could use his skills for good rather than for financial gain, and that he would now spend his time helping people stay safe from malware attacks. In July 2019, Judge J.P. Statmuller sentenced him to time served and 1 year of supervised release, no additional prison time. The judge recognized his contributions to society. Then, the judge suggested Hutchins seek a presidential pardon. Also, the prosecutors, for their part, acknowledged the tension in their own filing, and they compared him to a man who spent years robbing banks and that one day realized that he was wrong and worked to design better security systems. He deserves credit for his epiphany, they wrote. And there's a line in Hutchins' own writing that many, myself included, keep coming back to. He said you can be a good security researcher without a criminal past. And he's right. I know plenty of researchers who have never gotten a speeding ticket. But what do you do when somebody already has a past and has demonstrably changed? Is this the best case scenario for reform? Is this the outcome we want to reward in society? What does the justice system owe the victims of Kronos? Does it, or society in this case, that's a broad term and I can't think of a better one. What do they owe the man who stopped WannaCry? I don't think there's a universal answer here. I think reasonable people can disagree. And today, Marcus Hutchins is still active on various platforms, and from all accounts I can see is living a decent life. He's spoken at conferences and on podcasts, and although I don't agree with all his posts, I got a lot of respect for how he has owned his past and been open to talking about it for others. Cloudflare still hosts the WannaCry kill switch domain, because if it ever goes offline, the dormant copies of WannaCry sitting in the nooks and crannies of the internet would start encrypting again. His actions are still protecting people today, and I think that's worth knowing. The thing that keeps WannaCry contained isn't a government program or $1 billion security product with an F1 car or some agent bolted to it with a clever name. It's a domain registered by a kid from Devon who used to write malware in his bedroom. Now I want to pivot to the damage WannaCry caused. The technical execution is one thing. It's interesting to people like me, and probably you if you're still listening to this, but the real story of WannaCry isn't the code, it's the chaos. I want to paint this picture clearly, the best I can. So I want you to imagine yourself in these scenarios, because when it's said that WannaCry hit 200,000 machines, those are just numbers, and big numbers lose meaning fast. Let's put some faces on it. Starting with the United Kingdom and the National Health Service, which in some ways illustrates this concept of a weapon with no loyalty. And the National Health Service, by all accounts, was not the target or even probably on the target list. Nobody sat in a room and said, let's go after the British hospitals. That's an assumption, of course, but it's a very strong one in my opinion. WannaCry was indiscriminate. It was a worm after all, and it didn't care who you were. If you were unpatched and had port 445 open, you were getting hit. The National Health Service just happened to be running a patchwork of outdated systems, including machines still on Windows XP. And at that point, it was a 16-year-old operating system. There were also a ton of Windows 7 boxes that hadn't been updated. Slight tangent here, but in some ways, this point illustrates something I think about often. It's unrealistic to think that NHS staff or doctors who are charged with saving lives should be concerned with this type of stuff. But on the other hand, this is the world we live in, and we need to be realists. There's also a tendency of lawmakers to force regulations about patching and such down the throats of businesses, while those in the government don't have to live by those same regulations. There's also mandates having to have extra data that isn't really needed, just so they can subpoena people or just tax them more, kind of putting that data at risk if they don't have to follow said regulations in the first place. Now, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I just want to take a moment and highlight why this is hard. Getting back to WannaCry and Windows 7 boxes, Kaspersky later reported that 98% of the infected systems worldwide were running Windows 7, not XP. But Windows 10 had been around for almost 2 years at this point, as a free upgrade for most users. I want to call that out because I remember at the time, everyone was claiming that WannaCry was an XP problem. And when it wasn't, it was a patching problem, as Microsoft knew that these exploits were in the wild, or at least they were coming up to be in the wild. But let's back up a bit. It appears that they knew, since these exploits were patched via a Patch Tuesday upgrade a few months prior. I go into all that in my Not Pet Yet episode. But the fix existed, and in this case, it just had not been applied yet. There were over 600,000 organizations affected, varying in degrees of degradation. Some of the trusts were locked out of their systems, while others experienced disruption due to shared resources being down. And some took precautionary steps like just shutting their stuff down before it got to them. Now, some 595 GP practices were hit as well. These were like the direct offices for the doctors. Now, getting more serious, 5 hospitals, including the Barts Health in London, a major trauma unit, had to cease emergency services for a period of time. They had to close the emergency room. Now, ambulances in this case were diverted. So if you were having a heart attack or got in a car accident in certain parts of England that Friday, you were getting rerouted to a hospital further away because the closest one had ransomware notes on its screens instead of patient records. And even if you had routine or not emergency services, you weren't spared. Staff couldn't access patient records. MRI scanners went offline. Blood storage refrigerators that were networked, those went down too. Surgical equipment couldn't be delivered. An estimated 19,000 appointments were canceled in the week that followed. I think the most troubling ones that I found of those included appointments was 139 of them. They were for patients with suspected cancer referrals. Let that sit in for a moment. People waiting to find out if they had cancer had their appointments pushed back because of a terrorist attack. Or was this an act of war? Either way, the UK government called a meeting of COBRA. This is the Crisis Response Committee. I sure hope the leader of this org is called the Cobra Commander. This is a big deal though, as it's the group tasked with convening together to work together through terrorist attacks and national security emergencies, as that's what this was, a national security emergency. And to be clear, mainly because every government source document I read and researched for this episode said it, no organization paid the ransom, not one. The UK Department of Health later estimated that the total cost was at £92 million, roughly $114 million at the time. That includes $19 million in lost activities from canceled appointments and diverting patients, and another $73 million in IT costs to recover and harden the systems after the fact. Not going to lie, there's a small nugget of curiosity in me that wonders what the cost to the British taxpayers to upgrade the machines in the first place would have been. Was it less than $73 million? And here's the kicker, why a lot of seasoned cybersecurity people are jaded. In 2018, a parliamentary report found that all 200 hospitals or organizations that they spot checked in the wake of the WannaCry event still failed what they deemed basic cybersecurity checks. Every single one. But the United Kingdom wasn't the only victim. Spain got hit early. Telefonica, one of the world's largest telecommunications companies in the world, was among the first to report an incident. They told employees to turn off their computers, just shut down everything. There's reports of people walking through Telefonica's headquarters with megaphones telling people to disconnect from the network. In France, Renault had to stop production at several manufacturing sites. Their plants in Sotteville and their facility in Slovenia went dark. When the factory floor is networked and the network is compromised, you're not building cars that day. It's a cheese and wine day. And it's the same story at Nissan. Their manufacturing plant in Sunderland, northwest England, halted production as well. It's a fish and chips day, people. There's reports of FedEx in the United States having issues, or one of their subsidiaries having issues. It was not super clear. What I did find was a statement in which they disclosed that they were experiencing interference with their Windows-based systems, which in corporate legal speak means they were dealing with it, but don't dump our stock. I think that's what it means. And for legal reasons, let's just say that this is a reasonable conclusion that a reasonable person could get to, I think. Deutsche Bahn, the German railroad operator, had its passenger information displays compromised. Travelers at the German train station that day saw a ransom note instead of departures and arrivals on the boards. There's photos of this all over the internet, and it's one of those images that really captures the absurdity. You're standing in a train station in Frankfurt, and the screen that's supposed to tell you which platform to go to is instead asking you for Bitcoin. In Russia, the Ministry of Internal Affairs confirmed that over 1,000 machines were affected. The Russian telecommunications giant Megafon was hit. Russian railways reported disruptions. The Russian central bank said it had detected malware being distributed to banks, but they said that no resources were compromised. And China got hammered too, by all accounts. Universities across the country were affected. The Kuaihu 360 security firm issued a red alert. Gas stations in part of China saw their digital payment systems go offline, forcing customers to pay in cash. Now, some local police departments were affected as well. There were reports of police stations going down in India. And this is just the headline stuff. The names we know about, there were thousands of smaller businesses, local governments, schools, and organizations that got locked up and never made the news, never got a press release. They just ate the cost and rebuilt from backups or started from scratch. All in all, it's an estimated that WannaCry caused $4 billion in damages. And through the ransom site and wallet analysis, about $140,000 was paid to the attackers. $4 billion in global damage, $140,000 collected across 3 Bitcoin wallets for approximately 336 payments. That's a return on chaos of about 0.0035%. And usually, this is the kind of stuff that I would say gets someone CIA hit or MI5 hit, some random heart attack, or maybe discombobulated, which I guess is even more depressing if this is a real ransom operation, was that they couldn't even cash it out cleanly. The wallet sat untouched for nearly 3 months while the whole world watched. Every blockchain analytics company, every law enforcement agency, every 3-letter abbreviation you can think of was monitoring these 3 addresses. Then in August 2017, someone moved the Bitcoin wallet out, converted it through Shapeshift into Monero to watch the trail, and it disappeared. Shapeshift later confirmed that the transaction breached their terms of service and blacklisted the associated addresses. But by then, obviously, the damage was done. Somewhere, 52 Bitcoin became Monero, and that Monero, well, who knows what happened to it. But here's what I keep coming back to, and others do too. I'm not special, and I'm not some all-seeing oracle or anything. The ratio behind damage inflicted and money collected makes no sense that this was a purely criminal enterprise. You don't build a weapon this effective and then duct tape a yard sale cash box to it, which takes us back to those fundamental questions about what WannaCry actually was. Was it an accidental release of something still in development? Was it a test that got out of hand? Was it a deliberate act of disruption disguised as ransomware, where the money was really never the point? I don't really have an answer for that. No one does, definitively. But I think the damage tells us more than the code ever could in this case. The code was sophisticated and clumsy at the same time. The propagation mechanism was world-class. The payment mechanism was broke. The disconnect is part of the signal. This is a regular asymmetric warfare, or at least elements of it. The people who paid the price weren't intelligence officers or government officials or even tech executives. They were patients who couldn't get their cancer screening, factory workers who lost a shift, students who lost their thesis, and small business owners who lost everything on a server that wasn't backed up. An unpatched port, a leaked exploit, a Friday morning in May, $4 billion down the drain. Earlier in this episode, I told you that this was carried out by the North Korean offensive cyber group known as the Lazarus Group. And I told you that this was a lie in some ways, but a convenient lie for that time. And this is because most of the threat groups or the clustered activity that vendors, organizations, individuals, They attribute everything from North Korea to Lazarus. It all gets lumped under this umbrella term as Lazarus Group. And in some ways, this is helpful. North Korea operations in this domain are an order of magnitude different than Western aligned activities and doctrine. One easy way to see the difference is that Western doctrine doesn't explicitly state that they'll use the military to generate GDP or revenue for the regime. That's a sort of foreign concept for the West, one that I have explored in previous episodes. But the other kind of thing to think about is that there's combatant commands and geospecific areas of responsibilities in Western units, so they're a little less flexible. In military actions, units can pivot and retool for different missions, but leaders have to account for the cost in doing so. So it's sort of like changing the direction of a big ship. But going back to the idea of naming everything Lazarus Group, it's helpful in some ways. For most people not in the day-to-day operations of threat intelligence or attribution, it's a decent layer of abstraction. Depending on the wording of the document, it could be helpful for sanctions too. For example, any group attributed to North Korea or under the blanket term Lazarus Group could be something called out. It could also be the other way with sanctions too. Some people play the game of, we don't call this group Lazarus, we call this GTC 105 or Mythical Donut or something. I haven't seen anything where an overzealous prosecutor has been willing to test that theory in court, but who knows? Maybe someone gets bored one day and they test this novel theory. But on the surface, prosecuting a victim to get their files back seems like a dumb reason to charge someone with potentially supporting a hostile government. But there have been stupider claims brought through justice. It also helps sell books. The Lazarus Heist is a great book and wouldn't have resonated if Jeff White had spent the time dissecting each group and bureau. I, on the other hand, love getting into the weeds and being unlikable to the general audience, I guess. Or maybe I just think everyone that listens to this is above average and deserves a better take. And luckily for us, Google Mandiant and the United States Army have published open source analysis of the hierarchy of the bureaus and how they align to the state's missions. They're linked through in the show notes. Now, all starting from the top. All under Kim Jong-un's direction, North Korea runs its cyber operations through 3 main organizations, each with a different mandate. Think of it like 3 separate branches, each reporting up through different parts of the regime's power structure to the big guy. The first is the Reconnaissance General Bureau, or the RGB. And this is the biggest one, sitting under the General Staff Department of the Korean People's Army. This is North Korea's primary foreign intelligence service. It's equivalent to like the CIA and the NSA combined. And it handles intelligence collections, clandestine operations, and houses the vast majority of the cyber operators. Now, it's organized into 6 bureaus. Notably, there's no 4th bureau because the number 4 is considered taboo in North Korean culture. The 2 bureaus that matter for the cyber warfare aspects are the 3rd Bureau, which is the Foreign Intelligence, and the 5th Bureau, which is the Inter-Korean Affairs. The other bureaus are the 1st Bureau, which is for operations. The 2nd Bureau is for reconnaissance. The 6th Bureau is for technology. And the 7th Bureau is for support. So there's 6 total, even though there's a 7th Bureau. But like I said, there's no 4th Bureau. The next organization is the Ministry of State Security, or the MSS. This is the regime's counterintelligence service. Think domestic security and like overseas counter-espionage. Now, it operates autonomously from the military. Its cyber footprint is much smaller, but it's targeted. And then the last one is the United Front Department, or the UFD. This one sits under the Workers' Party of Korea directly. It's the influence and propaganda arm. It's less about hacking and attacking people and more about kind of shaping narratives. And it uses cyber means to do it, mostly through the use of like troll armies. And this feels timely since she doesn't have a LinkedIn, but congratulations are in order for Kim Yo-jong getting promoted from deputy director of the PAD, or the Propaganda and Agitation Department of the Workers' Party of Korea, to the full-on director, replacing Kim Ki-nam. As a few days ago, when I was recording this podcast at least, the PAD is widely believed to shape the directives of the UFD operations, or to kind of help what the propaganda should be. So let's start with the RGB's 3rd Bureau first. It's the largest. And this is where the heavy hitters are believed to live. Lab 110 is assessed to be expanded and reorganized versions of the famous Bureau 121. And this is the unit that kind of put North Korean offensive capabilities on the map back in the day. It operates out of front companies historically based in Northeast China in cities like Dailon and Shenyang. I went into more detail on all of this in the Sony hack episode about how all of this works. But when you hear the group Lazarus Group in the news, it almost always refers to activity coming out of Lab 110. But here's the critical nuance. Lazarus Group is like the umbrella term that Western threat intelligence uses to cover what are actually distinct operational units under 110. Now, the three main ones are usually classified as temp hermit, which many believe is the most accurate description of Lazarus in that narrow sense. They have been active since 2013, and this is the Strategic Intelligence Collection Unit. They target governments, defense organizations, telecoms, and financial institutes worldwide. When North Korea wants to conduct a high-profile destructive espionage attack, Sony Pictures, WANNACRY, this is most likely the crew. Their mission is collecting strategic intelligence to benefit core North Korean state interests and break stuff and steal your imaginary computer money in some ways. Speaking of stealing money, next is APT-38, or Blue Norov. Now, this is a financially motivated unit known for going after interbank transfer systems, specifically SWIFT, to steal tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in single operations. I'm going to do a future episode on this, but this is the Bangladeshi bank heist, and it's where they walked away with nearly $1 billion and netted $81 million for their operations. Now, this is the group's kind of like signature work. They also have a subgroup sometimes called Crypto Core, or Dangerous Password, that focuses exclusively on cryptocurrency theft. APT-38 is seen as like being patient and methodical. They've been observed sitting in victim networks for a long, long time, sometimes over 150 days before executing the heist. And they're willing to deploy destructive malware to cover their tracks on the way out. In some ways, they're the most successful bank robbers in history, operating at nation-state scale. Silent Kalima is next. They are seen as the reconnaissance and targeting unit. They focus on like foreign businesses, government agencies, defense industry, and financial services infrastructure. Their primary mission appears to be military and government intelligence collection, but they also conduct cybercrime on the side as like a supplemental revenue generation. Think of them as like the unit that maps the terrain, identifies vulnerabilities, and gathers intelligence that other units or future operations can exploit. Kind of like access brokers in some ways. Now, Bureau 325 is one of the newest units. It was publicly announced in January of 2021, and it was originally stood up specifically to target COVID-19 research and vaccine manufacturing organizations, which tells you something about how the regime creates cyber units in response to immediate national priorities. This is the flexibility that North Korea units demonstrate. Now, there's defector reporting indicating that the unit wasn't fully operational at the time and that personnel was drafted from existing groups like Temp Hermit and Kimsuki. I'll get to them in a minute. Now, over time, Bureau 325 has expanded well beyond its COVID mandate, targeting defectors, defense organizations, media, cryptocurrency services, and financial institutions. The fact that its mission set keeps growing suggests that it's gained confidence among the senior leadership, or there's some political games at play. Possibly someone important is in charge of that organization. I'm kind of speculating here, but I like to ask myself, why, when the facts point to a causation? And in my mental model, this seems like the most likely answer. Now, pivoting to the RGB's fifth bureau, the Inter-Korean Affairs Cyber Mission Set, it's essentially dominated by one group, Kimsuki. Kind of operates with a different mandate and in a completely different bureau. Kimsuki targets intelligence collection campaigns focused on geopolitical events and negotiations affecting North Korean interests. Now, their primary targets are in the US and South Korea, obviously, and specifically individuals in government, military, academia, manufacturing, and like think tanks who have experience in defense, security, and especially nuclear non-proliferation policy. They're not trying to steal money. They're trying to understand what the other side knows and what it plans to do, particularly around nuclear security negotiations. They also collect personal and financial data from South Korean targets, likely to build infrastructure for future espionage actions. Moving out of the RGB, next up is the Ministry of State Security, or the MSS, and this is where APT-37 comes into the picture. APT-37 is the MSS's primary cyber unit. Their assessed mission from Mandiant is covert intelligence gathering in support of North Korea's strategic military, political, and economic interests. Now, what really distinguishes APT-37 from the other RGB units is their targeting pattern. They go after foreign joint venture partners, defectors, and defector support agencies, and humanitarian organizations. Their target profile maps to like the MSS's counterintelligence mandate. Identify threats to the regime, essentially. Track people who's left and monitor those organizations that help them. In the past few years or so, and as highlighted in 2023 by Mandia, there's been an observed decrease in APT-37 activity, matched with an uptick in similar targeting from Kimsucky clusters, which may indicate that some of this is organizational consolidation or mission handoff happening within the regime by like the leadership of the Cyber Command. It's entirely possible that some kind of joint operations or internal politics are in there too. Then there's the last set of operators that conduct operations, and they don't really have a name, but they're attributed to North Korea and the umbrella group of Lazarus Group. And this is the United Front Department, which is under the central command of the Workers' Party of Korea. They employ like a horde of like cyber trolls online. And like I said, the UFD doesn't operate like an APT group in the traditional sense, but it does have a significant online influence operation, and these activities are tracked. Now, their primary tool is just an army of people on computers who hijack South Korean user accounts and flood web forums with comment sections for pro-regime propaganda. Now, in a 2-year span, those operators allegedly posted 68,000 propaganda items across South Korean web platforms. The strategic objective isn't intelligence collection or financial theft, it's political subversion. The UFD's endgame is establishing and nurturing pro-North Korean political sympathies within South Korean civil society. There's also some targeting overlaps with APT-37 and the 5th Bureau's Kimsucky around Korean Peninsula issues. But the UFD's cyber activity is fundamentally about influence, not exploitation. And none of these reports explicitly call this out, but I wouldn't be surprised that these groups are targeting Americans and Europeans too. Other nations are probably doing similar operations. There's an idea. I should probably play the conspiracy theory song before I go here, but whatever. There's an idea or a theory that's captured by a Belgian psychologist named Matthias Desmet in a book named The Psychology of Totalitarianism. It was published in 2022. That under conditions of widespread loneliness, free-floating anxiety, frustration, and lack of meaning, something common in modern societies, a crisis of narrative emerges that focuses people's fears and anxiety on a single object. Now put your tinfoil hats on. So maybe like a virus, a group, or a threat. In his observations, this leads to a kind of collective hypnosis. 30% of the population becomes fanatically gripped by the narrative. They believe it uncritically and even absurd or contrary claims. They lose their independent thinking capacities and empathy, and they just repeat scripted talking points like NPCs in a video game and become highly susceptible to propaganda manipulation. They're willing to self-sacrifice, enforce it on others, and attack dissenters. Now, in the UFD's context, they want to keep this group of people as loyal as possible. Another roughly 40% goes passively along, now out of social conformity or self-interest, but without full fanaticism. The remaining 30% stays skeptical and resistant, and they can see through it. The UFD is probably trying to discover who these people are and labor camp them up. Now, wrapping up my point on the Lazarus Group and the attribution aspects of North Korea, it's important to keep things loose as well. For one, most people, it probably doesn't need to be tracked at this level. SOC analysts, keyboard warriors in the trenches, securing networks day to day, who is doing what should be pretty low on your priority list from a nation state perspective. It's usually more of a what are they doing and how is where you should be focused. But it's important to have a rough picture if this sort of threat intelligence intersects with your interest or career. And loosely speaking, wrapping things up here, you need to consider that these are distinct operational units spread across 3 different parent organizations, each with different missions, different targets, and different tradecraft. Some steal money, some steal secrets, some conduct destructive attacks, some run influence operations, and the regime reorganizes constantly, standing up new units like Bureau 325 when priorities shift, drafting personnel between groups, and sharing tools and infrastructure in ways that make Western-style attribution extremely difficult by design. Then you couple in some of the obscure groups into the mix as well. The remote IT workers who we've all heard about, These are the highly skilled IT workers, thousands of them from North Korea. Their focus is both domestically and abroad. First, to generate revenue and finance for the country's weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missile programs. But these workers also acquire freelance contracts from clients around the world and sometimes pretend to be based in the US or other countries. And what I find interesting about this is that they mainly engage in legitimate IT work. There has been some incidents in which they have misused their access to enable malicious actions on objective, but overall it seems that they just seem to be doing sysadmin work, which is sort of interesting to me. Now, I probably went too in the weeds here, and I wanted to dispel the Lazarus myth. North Korea has a robust, complex offensive capability, and the organizational complexity isn't a bug, it's a feature here. One of the most confusing things about cyber warfare is that attribution is incredibly hard and is usually based on multiple variables forming some sort of heuristic that reflects confidence. Or the government or an organization just flat out says, TLP, trust me, bro, and blames someone. I brought this up numerous times. In another high-profile North Korean attack, the one on Sony Pictures, in retaliation for the movie The Interview, allegedly, there was evidence, and that evidence was a little shaky. Some people suspected it to be Russians, an inside job, or some power play, which itself sounded right out of a script submitted to the entertainment company. Attribution here was announced via a press conference in which it sounded confident, but relied heavily on appeals to authority rather than providing real motive. I'll quote a portion of it here. Quote, after careful investigation, the United States is publicly attributing the massive WannaCry cyber attack to North Korea. We do not make this allegation lightly. We do so with evidence, and we do so with partners. Other governments and private companies agree. The United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Japan have seen our analysis, and they join us in denouncing North Korea for WannaCry. Commercial partners have also acted. Microsoft traced their attack to cyber affiliates of the North Korean government, and others in the security community have contributed their analysis. End quote. So, in other terms, the United States is claiming WannaCry was caused by North Koreans. Our Five Eye partners and Japan agree because they got the same analysis, and Microsoft did as well, since otherwise President Trump might renegotiate their sweet government contracts. Now, I say all of this in jest, and we're not claiming this is what went down. This isn't even my opinion or anything like that. It's rather just me poking holes in how easy it is to get around that. And later on, more evidence was provided. The most convincing, in my opinion, is the FBI Cyber Behavior Analysis Center, and they found Hangul language fonts installed on the machine that created the ransom note. These are language files, as well as the time zone being UTC plus 900. Now, both of those lead to Korean fingerprints. Admittedly, the Russians do mess around with metadata all the time, so it's not like this is a smoking gun, but not everyone takes this sort of care. This becomes even more convincing if you believe it escaped rather than being released. Why go through the trouble of messing with the metadata for an internal project of sorts? But like I said, there was doubts about the attribution as well. Now, one interesting thing that gets left behind during ransomware attacks are ransomware notes. These are tidbits of information that provide motivation for the attack, sometimes, and the opportunity to do linguistic analysis. Now, with the rise of LLMs, I have a feeling that this will start fading in effectiveness, but in 2017, we lived in a more wholesome time. Now, with WannaCry, researchers analyzed the ransom note and they determined its author wasn't very good at speaking Korean. In an article published at Bank Info Security titled, quote, WannaCry's ransom note, Great Chinese, Not So Hot Korean, Linguistic Analysis Suggests Native Chinese Speaker Wrote Ransom Note by Michael J. Schwartz. This theory is summed up in the following. The identity of the individual or group behind the massive WannaCry ransomware campaign remains unclear, but whoever wrote the ransom note appears to have been fluent in Chinese, pretty good at written English, but lacking Korean language skills, according to a new linguistic analysis published by security firm Flashpoint. End quote. Flashpoint concluded that the original letter was written in Chinese, then rewritten in English, and then translated en masse using Google Translate. Now, obviously, linguistic analysis is not enough for a conclusive determination, but it's a variable worth considering. For what it's worth, I wouldn't consider it outrageous for there to be some sort of joint tasking between Chinese operators, state-funded or contracted out to North Korea, and they're all held up 20 deep in like a hotel room, launching campaigns for the supreme leader. Park Jin-hook and later more conspirators in 2021 were indicted for both these attacks and additional ones like the Bangladeshi bank heists. The evidence in there, as well as the Google evidence, does highlight that there is some code similarity and reuse, especially around TLS ciphers that were specific to known North Korean cyber backdoors. There's also infrastructure reuse that's been documented. So could it have been the North Koreans responsible for WannaCry? Probably. Could they have had Chinese assistance? Possibly. Could this be like a huge false flag put together by a secret government cabal to do something nefarious? Sure, I guess. But the Occam's razor framing of this would probably just point to it being the North Koreans. This one got out of hand, or it was an early attempt at something, and they have since iterated and become master computer money thieves. Philosophically speaking, WannaCry presents some hard questions that to this day have yet to be resolved. Looking at this in basic terms and the alleged series of events, I want to emphasize this, alleged, the NSA built a weapon and chose to hoard it rather than protect their citizens and disclose it. The shadow brokers stole it and released it into the wild. North Koreans picked it up and built something with it that they couldn't fully control. And ordinary people, nurses, factory workers, students, they paid the price for decisions made in rooms that they never knew existed. Capabilities that they didn't know existed. These people's jobs aren't being cybersecurity experts or threat modelers. They take care of people. They build things. They keep society running. They are on the battlefield. This is a battlefield that they don't even think about or know that it exists until they can't receive care that they need, and care that taxpayer dollars also funded, or in this case, I guess, pounds. Which, ironically, if you go with the alleged origin of these exploits, taxpayer dollars also funded that as well. Or when they're held up in long lines because the banks don't work or gas stations can't pump gas. Should the NSA have disclosed this to Microsoft? Is it okay that the US military is using exploits in US products that promote an offensive first mentality instead of defensive posturing? That's a question for you to ponder, but what's the trade-offs? Can they not complete their missions without this? Are their missions worth doing? Does it make us more safe? How are we determining that? How do you punish the shadow brokers? And how do you punish them for releasing the code? There's an argument that code wants to be free. Is releasing exploit code going to be a crime now? What are you going to do about all the open source hacking tools? Penetration testing platforms out there. Threat actors are starting to use open source EDR solutions as C2 platforms these days, repurposing known good applications for nefarious reasons. Hacking at its purest, I guess. I keep coming back to it all with the following summary. WannaCry wasn't North Korea trying their hardest. By most measures, it was really clumsy, underpowered, and poorly monetized. Despite there being no one publicly confirming it at the time, it's widely believed that the NSA notified Microsoft of the vulnerability before the shadow brokers leak, but only after the leak was imminent. Microsoft released the patch on March 14, 2017, exactly 1 month before the April 14th shadow brokers leak. So the patch existed. Most people just hadn't applied it yet. So a weapon built by the most sophisticated intelligence agency in human history, stolen by persons unknown, widely to believe to be Russians, weaponized by a sanctioned nation state, and was stopped by a $10 domain registered by a security analyst in his bedroom, who later got arrested for writing malware. If this is what accidental looks like, what does intentional look like? And if you've made it this far, can you please like, subscribe, comment, and share this podcast wide and far? I don't run ads and I barely market this podcast in favor of using my time to build episodes. So doing so is a huge help. I also have a website, IntrusionsInDepth.com, where you can sign up for the newsletter and participate in the AMAs and guest episodes. There's a paid support function there too, if you want to liberate your dollars, but right now, there's no special perks for doing so. It's a work in progress. And with that, I'm Josh Depp. Thanks for listening.
Frank